And then at that point, we'll open up to general questions for everyone in the audience. We'll let that go for 15, 20 minutes or so. The committee can also ask at that point. Well, let's see how that goes in natural, kind of let it play out. And at that point, we'll all ask you to leave, and just the committee and Josh will kind of talk about the thesis process. And then we'll make our decision on the oral presentation today. So we also have some folks watching online, so hello everyone online. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Joshua Bauer and his presentation on this project out in Rio Blanco County, Colorado. So Joshua.
Oh. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Again, my name is Joshua Bauer, and I'm excited to present to you today my thesis research entitled A Rock in a Hard Place, Exploring Fremont Territoriality through the Pinnacle Architecture of Douglas Creek, Rio Blanco County, Colorado. I want us to look at this masonry site, one of many in Douglas Creek, and we may ask ourselves, what are they? Who made them? When were they made? Some researchers think it was the Fremont, but is that true? We look at where they're located in this rugged landscape, and we may wonder, what importance did they have to their builders? And what purpose did they serve? Archaeologists in Douglas Creek have been curious about these questions for decades, and with this project, I try to understand their purpose and particularly test whether they were inherently defensive or not, an idea proposed by several archaeologists before me. So the thrust of this research is to explore the concept of territoriality among the Fremont of Douglas Creek in Rio Blanco County, shown here in northwestern Colorado. And beyond just territoriality, I'm interested in the question of passive versus active defensibility, and I'll explain what all these terms mean in a few moments. To explore these concepts, I've synthetically analyzed a sample of 7 open masonry structures, usually located atop Pinnacle landforms throughout the canyon. And from here on, I'll mostly just call them pinnacles. How these structures relate to territoriality is especially interesting because some of them have been dated to periods associated with regional droughts and migrations into the area from 850 to 1300 CE. And so there are many implicit themes in my research, such as climate change, research, food insecurity, and resilience, migration, incursion, and warfare. However, I explore them all through the prism of these pinnacle structures. I organize my research around 3 questions, and together they're designed to examine the pinnacles from geographic, architectural, and visual perspectives. I begin by asking what are the environmental conditions and access features associated with each pinnacle structure. I go on to explore what does the construction of the pinnacles suggest about their function. And finally, I determine what are the view sheds afforded from the pinnacles. And to enrich the insights from each of these questions, they are embedded with a series of sub-questions that I will talk about a bit later. So let's take a look at the environmental setting for this project. Douglas Creek is in the southeastern quadrant of the Colorado Plateau's Uinta Basin, shown here. And as we can see, it's bound to the north by the Uinta Mountains, the south by the Tavaputs Plateau, and the east by the Piceance Basin, and the west by the Wasatch Plateau. And this is a vast and dramatic landscape of sandstone escarpments, deeply incised ancient drainages, and sparse water. Riparian communities are found in the lowlands with pinyon and juniper along foothills and forests at high elevation. Douglas Creek is a tributary of the White River to the north. And as this photo shows, this is a rugged canyon landscape with thin hollows, abrupt slopes, and tablelands, and is characterized by the upper Sonoran vegetation zone. It's a semi-arid region with scarce water and an average of only 90 days growing season, an important consideration for the Fremont people. Among the many people who have lived in the Colorado Plateau are the Fremont, a group that alternated between hunter-gatherer and horticultural lifeways. They're defined by distinctive items of material culture, such as one-rod and bundle basketry, unique footwear, clay figurines, ornate headdresses, and a particular style of ceramics. They're perhaps best known, though, for their remarkable rock art traditions, and among them is the classic vernal style shown here to the right, as well as here to the right. Now, the Fremont are divided into several variants, as we see on the left, including the San Rafael and the Uinta group that occupied the Uinta Basin. The Douglas Creek Fremont are another variant proposed by CSU's Steve Griesman, most similar to their Uinta and San Rafael neighbors to the west. And they stand out mostly through their distinctive rock art motifs, dry-laid masonry structures on isolated pinnacles, and beehive storage granaries. They aggregated near tributary confluences along Douglas Creek and likely kept small farm plots in those broad open areas. And some of the first Europeans to visit this area were from the Dominguez Escalante expedition of 1776. And these Spaniards were led by Native American guides to carry out a scouting mission throughout the Intermountain West. And in the map here, we see the route they took through Douglas Creek towards the White River. Impressed with the rock art in the corridor, they dubbed it El Cañón Pintado, or Painted Canyon in Spanish. Archaeologists began researching this area in the 20th century. Elmer Smith of the University of Utah was the first to formally record the masonry architecture here, and he recovered roofing materials at the Edge site, one of the sites that I studied. University of Denver's Gil Wanger came back out here in the early 50s to carry out the first complete and systematic survey of Douglas Creek, and he suggested a defensive function for the pinnacles. Throughout the 70s and 80s, CSU's Laboratory of Public Archaeology, as well as Steve Kreisman with Western Wyoming College, carried out extensive surveys of the region and excavations at Texas Creek and Edge. LOPA found site concentrations along tributary confluences, and Kreisman endorsed the idea that these pinnacles were defensive. Most recently, others like Steve Baker and Richard Hawk have made the arguments that these pinnacles structures are ceremonial or mortuary sites, or that they represent agricultural calendars, and I discussed the merits of these ideas further in my thesis. These time-lapse photos show from Wanger in the 50s, LOPA in the 70s, and my present work here with the Center for Mountain and Plains Archaeology show the management value of my work. For instance, we see significant damage to Rocky Ford in recent decades, and federal land management will be interested in that information. As part of my project, I'll be submitting site revisitation forms to the BLM so that they have updated information for each of these sites. Let's talk now a bit about the principal theory underlying my work. Simply put, territoriality is the exclusive use of a resource area maintained through regional competition, defense, and signaling. Anthropologists believe that this behavior is contingent upon many factors such as the density, accessibility, and predictability of resources, and they also believe that it correlates to demographics, group size, and social dynamics. Territorial people would have at least two strategic options for conflict resolution. In terms of these Fremont pinnacles, active defensibility would mean that their occupants engaged in conflict, faced down enemies, and endeavored to deter assailants through direct confrontation. And in this case, the pinnacles could be understood as strongholds. Passive defensibility, on the other hand, would mean that the occupants avoided conflict, retreated from danger, watched from on high for outsiders, and were protected through the inaccessibility of the structures. And in this case, the pinnacles would be understood as refuges. McCool and Yavorsky have made this argument for the extremely remote Fremont pinnacles of 9 Mile Canyon shown here. Now, for hunter-gatherers, Freeman and Andrews have proposed the forager effort model, which predicts that territoriality emerges when diminished resource productivity incentivizes shared efforts and ownership. I explore other theories in my paper, but this model seems especially fitting for the Douglas Creek Fremont. I also draw on the human relation area files to compare ethnographic evidence for territoriality and land tenure among foragers of the West. Among farming societies, on the other hand, people would have a mutual need to invest in cropland and secure it for exclusive use. Farmers may also build monumental architecture to signal territorial ownership or make improvements to the land and implement monitoring systems. For farmers to maintain group assets, they would depend on individuals' consent for collective action and an ethos for shared prosperity. In my text, I support these concepts with more ethnographic data from E. Harath about farmers of the West. Archaeologists have postulated that the Fremont developed territoriality during the late formative, a time of social and environmental change, and they've cited a range of evidence for this claim. For instance, the Fremont maintained small farm plots, which would have needed privatization and protection. And as I mentioned earlier, their masonry architecture has long been viewed as part of a conflict resolution strategy. Also, there are strong suggestions of violence in their rock art, such as headhunting seen here. And finally, some have even suggested that the Fremont practiced cannibalism. These patterns are seen broadly in the Southwest too, where warfare and resource competition increased from the middle to the late period. And archaeologists have compiled extensive and unmistakable evidence for violence throughout the region during this time. And they believe that this led to dramatic socio-cultural transformations. And these are critical insights, since most Fremont occupations seem to have ended around 1300 CE. And these concepts carry over to Douglas Creek Fremont as well. Wanger posited that the dry conditions there would have supported small and possibly vulnerable populations, and who would have built these the forts for protection. Kreisman cited the unique rock art and ceramic typology there that attest to a regionalized expression of Fremont culture. He also cited the locations of the pinnacles and granaries again as evidence for conflict resolution. Chronology is important here as well, and we have dates for 3 sites in this study, which place the pinnacles within this tumultuous period that I referenced in the last slide. And finally, most importantly, Douglas Creek was a known travel corridor during the Spanish expedition and likely would have previously funneled Athabascan, Numic, and other ethno-linguistic groups into the region, possibly leading to conflict. With that background in mind, let's get into my project data. This map shows the 7 pinnacles that I sampled for my research, and you can see that 5 are located within the Canyon Pintado National Historic District, and 2 more are outside of it. And also, considering the sensitivity of these site locations, some of the photos and maps that you see here today will change in my manuscript. Here we see 4 Mile Overlook and Banty's Twist Overlook. In these photos, we can get a sense for the remote and rugged settings for these pinnacles, as well as their masonry styles. Rocky Ford Overlook and Mountain Overlook are 2 more pinnacles located within the National Historic District. You will notice that Mountain Overlook is not exactly on a pinnacle landform, and that it has a narrow horseshoe shape, illustrating some of the unique qualities of these sites. Edge is the 5th site within Canyon Pintado, and here we see some of the high cliffs associated with these sites that present real dangers to people accessing them. This is one of the best studied sites in the area and has been excavated by LOPA and others. And here are the 2 sites in my sample located outside of Canyon Pintado. Texas Creek is a well-known site which has produced dates into the 16th century. It also has the highest walls and the only wooden post reinforcement that I found. And to the right, we see Spook Mountain, a site overlooking extremely high cliffs. And this is the site that Hawk believes represents an agricultural calendar. And selecting these sites involved a review of data from the Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation to determine which best fall into the category of open masonry pinnacle architecture. The list of sites I chose from featured both cultural resource management and academic projects, and by asking questions of cumulative data sets, my research is a good example of synergy between those 2 realms. Now, part of my viewshed question deals with visible granaries, one of which is shown here. And these were used by the Fremont to store corn and other important resources and are located in well-hidden areas across the landscape. To the right, we can see their proximity to some of the pinnacles, which suggests that there may have been a visual association between these 2 types of masonry architecture. And here I lay out the many sub-questions embedded into my research. The first question, for geography, I'm interested in how conspicuous the pinnacles are from the canyon floor, the presence of blinds and obstructions on the landform, and cliffs associated with the area. I also look at how far removed sites are from the canyon, which would correlate to warning times for advancing war parties. Architectural elements, the second question. I looked at the type, size, and shaping of rocks used in masonry. I also look at wall curvature, course consistency, as well as roof and design elements. And these details help reveal how much effort and planning went into construction. I also look at the size of each structure to account for people capacity. And lastly, I consider artifacts and middens associated with the sites to discuss variation between them. And the final question for viewshed, I was interested in whether resources like granaries and arable land were in view from the pinnacles. I also tested whether there was any intervisibility between the pinnacles, which could suggest a communication system. And finally, I looked at maximum canyon visibility from each pinnacle, which correlates to monitoring of the travel corridor and warning times for incoming outsiders. And for each of these questions, I'll talk about my theoretical orientation, my methods, my results, and the implications I drew from them. And so the concept underlying my first question about environmental conditions and access is that landscapes can lend themselves to conflict resolution strategies. Many landscape features can protect people, such as steep slopes, talus ground, jagged outcroppings, high elevations, and cliffs. And we can wager that as a people will look after their land will look after them. And together they constitute a system which shapes social identities and political institutions, as Van Valkenburg and Osborne point out. And for this component of my research, I employed pedestrian survey to collect in-field observations at each site, the immediate vicinity, and along access paths. I also used drone photography to capture aerial perspectives. And I used GIS software to measure elevation gain and access path distance. To quantify warning times, I drew from Naismith's rule, which is an old mountaineering principle that calls for an extra hour of time for every 600 meters of elevation gain. And finally, to measure the relative danger of nearby cliffs, I used Murray and colleagues' definition for the average stride of an adult male, about 75 centimeters. And the idea here was to determine if a single misstep could mean a fall from a dangerous cliff. I also use their definition for the average pace of walking, 4 kilometers per hour for travel times. And so these images show some of my findings. On the top left, we can see the inconspicuousness of the pinnacles, even when they are close to the canyon floor, like here at 4 Mile. On the top right, we see the abundance of outcrops and boulders, as well as steep slopes that obstruct pathways to a lot of these pinnacles. And at some sites like Banty's Twist, these obstructions are unavoidable. On the bottom left, I show some of the blinds that are associated with these sites that offer tactical opportunities to Pinnacle occupants in the case of a skirmish. And here at Spook Mountain, extensive bedrock outcropping could have concealed several warriors. On the bottom right, we can see the high cliffs near Edge, which present real dangers to attackers. And while not all sites featured cliffs this high, most of them are associated with sheer walls that present risks. This chart shows the minimum warning times from the canyon access points to each structure, which correlates to warning time for Pinnacle occupants. We can see it ranges a bit from the very far removed mountain overlook to the Edge site, which sits just above the canyon. And in my manuscript, I discuss how these times would have given people an opportunity to prepare for incoming invaders. And Edge was the only site that failed to meet the 10-minute minimum that I established as ample preparation time. And so most of these sites are inconspicuous from the canyon floor, and some are even hidden in plain view as they are well camouflaged on the landscape. Access paths to the pinnacles are rugged and feature numerous obstructions, and several of the sites offer blind opportunities that would have aided in defense. Also, there are frequent cliffs along access paths or near pinnacles that amount to significant risks for attackers. And finally, most of these sites are far enough from the canyon floor that occupants would have had time to prepare for incoming enemies. In the text, I argue that the builders would have sought out naturally defensible locations, and that this amounts to careful planning and intention on their part, considering the range of options available in Douglas Creek. At some sites, the builders seem to have made concessions as a negotiation for ideal defensibility. For instance, they may have sacrificed inconspicuousness for dangerous cliffs to protect them. And ultimately, I make the case that these results support the hypothesis for passive defensibility, because occupants would have benefited from these defensive landscapes by avoiding direct confrontations. My second question deals with architecture, and I orient my work around the notion that a territorial people would use landscape markers to signal their territory. And in this sense, structures are both symbolic markers and physical spaces of protection. In the text, I talk about how high, thick walls are inherently defensive, and I discuss two types of fortifications. Strongholds are elaborately built and feature large curtains or walls which shield inhabitants. Refuges, on the other hand, are expedient, simplistic, and characterized by commanding viewsheds and remoteness. And to address this question, I once again employed pedestrian survey to collect in-field measurements and descriptions and observations, but I also created 3D photogrammetry models to account for the subjective elements such as flushness, wall flushness, and course consistency. Again, I capture aerial images with drone technology for the best perspectives of the pinnacles. And for size capacity, I use Narrow's classic formula, which states that a structure's capacity is roughly 1/10 of its area in meters. And finally, I review literature and legacy data from LOPA stored in CSU's archaeological repository for excavated material culture associated with these sites. I found that all of these sites were built with unprepared, locally available sandstone slabs, as seen in the top left. I also found that these sites feature a single entrance. Some, like Texas Creek to the top right, would fit only a single person at a time. The artifacts and middens associated with these sites suggest common domestic activities, such as the metate fragment on the bottom left. And on the bottom right, we can see an example of flush masonry walls at Rocky Ford. Some sites feature flush walls, while others billowed, but as a necessary function for balance. This chart shows the size capacity for the 7 pinnacles. And based on Narrow's formula, they would have fit between 10 and 2.5 adults. In the text, I envisioned scenarios where small groups of people were using these sites as refuges. Salient patterns emerge from this research question. First is that the construction attests to attention and care by the builders, although the structures are not always so meticulously built. Second, there are some indices for defensibility, such as single entryways. And finally, I argue that the material culture reflect the common daily activities of the habitation site. In the manuscript, I make the case that this evidence suggests a strong organized effort, albeit by people with limited resources. I contend that some cases of wall inconsistency are a function of structural integrity and not expediency. And although these structures are not especially sophisticated, I detect an insinuation of deep investment and importance for the builders and occupants. Again, I argue that this evidence supports the hypothesis for passive defensibility, in part because they lack the infrastructure of a true stronghold. For my final question about Pinnacle view sheds, I discuss how a territorial people would need the power of observation to monitor travel corridors and critical resources like crops and granaries. It would also facilitate long-distance communication for security purposes and help people prepare for raiding parties. In my thesis, I discuss how Fremont and nearby districts likely monitored resources, much like I test for here. For this question, I relied on ArcGIS's viewshed spatial analysis tool and had to account for viewer height, input a latitude-adjusted z-factor for Rio Blanco County. And I also account for the limits of human vision outlined in a recent paper by Spanish archaeologists, which helped me provide realistic figures. And finally, I used data for slope and distance to drainage to account for arable land, and this step entailed a suite of ArcGIS tools, such as Euclidean distance, reclassification, slope, weighted overlay, and zonal histogram. And here's an example of the viewshed results for one Pinnacle site, Banty's Twist. On the left, we see the simple binary viewshed and the 2.5 kilometer buffer to account for human eyesight. And this site has 2 granaries in its viewshed and achieves a maximum of 2.5 kilometers of canyon visibility. To the right, you can see the results for visible arable land for the same site. Each green square represents roughly 1.5 acres of land suitable for agriculture. And for arable land, I used the more conservative 750 meter buffer, since such broad areas would be harder to monitor than canyon corridors or granaries. And here we see some of the viewshed results. On the left, we see there's a wide range of acreage for visible arable land among these pinnacles. And on the right, we see that all these sites offer good visibility into the canyon, which correlate to between 38 and 23 minutes of total warning time. And these are slightly different from the warning times in my first question, which only account for access paths from the canyon. And so what I found is that these pinnacles offer optimal visibility of the canyon, up to 2.5 kilometers. They also offer some visibility of arable land between 2 and 72 acres. And while 3 of the pinnacles have granaries within their viewsheds, there is no intervisibility achieved in the 7 pinnacles of my sample. In the text, I discuss how occupants would have had time to prepare for outsiders traveling through the canyon corridor, and I argue that resource protection was a probable function of pinnacle locations. The visual associations of the pinnacles and granaries with arable land I cite as evidence for the pinnacle's Fremont origins. And I also discuss how there would have been little intercommunication between these sites except through possible smoke signals. In the end, I conclude that this evidence here supports the hypothesis for active defensibility, because occupants would have had the option to descend from the pinnacles to deter thieves. And this presents some interesting possibilities that impact my interpretation. In the text, I explore some possible functions for these pinnacles, citing ideas by other scholars in the area. These include uses as mortuary and ceremonial sites, as well as lunisolar observatories and stronghold fortifications. I don't believe the evidence supports these possibilities as much. I do, however, find good support for these sites as habitations and observation points. But ultimately, I argue that these sites are more convincingly refuge fortifications, considering their natural defensibility, strategic locations, and relatively simplistic designs. I go on to explore the implications that my results may have for Douglas Creek, Fremont culture history. I argue that these pinnacle occupants were primarily engaged in a form of passive defensibility. However, they would have retained the option for strategic flexibility and tactical adaptability. I consider the possibility that these masonry structures served multiple functions, such as habitations and observation points, in addition to refuges. And finally, I discussed that these Fremont may have devised such conflict resolution strategies in response to dramatic social and environmental changes. I provide this useful chronology in my thesis, which sequences the dates most important to the Douglas Creek pinnacles that I cite throughout the text. If we look about a quarter of the way down, we see that drought cycles and war in the southwest preceded the late formative period and the collapse of the Chaco Canyon system to the south. The bottom half of the chart includes dates for the period often cited with the Fremont decline, as well as estimated dates for Athabascan and Numic peoples reaching Fremont lands. I show dates for 2 of the pinnacles in my study here, which correlate to that tumultuous era. And I conclude by contending that my project has provided some key insights about the Douglas Creek pinnacles. First, they are associated with landscapes that offer abundant natural defensive features and are usually quite inconspicuous. Second, the masonry construction reflects significant planning and effort, but also limited manpower. Third, the commanding view sheds attest to clear intention and on behalf of the builders, likely to monitor the travel corridor and possibly to protect resources. And finally, I believe that these pinnacles are best understood as refuges, meant to protect people primarily engaged in passive defensibility, with the option for some strategic flexibility. I do outline some of the questions that I was unable to answer. First, the multifunctionality of these pinnacles remains unclear, as I argue that they could have been habitation sites or observation points as well as refuges. And although I argue that these pinnacles are Fremont in origin and cite dates from 3 sites, there is still a need for clearer temporal and cultural association for them. And finally, although themes of war and conflict underlie my research, there is limited evidence for violence in the Douglas Creek area, particularly among the Fremont, only the clues that I identify for it here. I offer some ideas for future researchers in the area. Most importantly, my work was just a sample of the pinnacles in Douglas Creek, and there are at least 8 more in the area to compare with my findings, perhaps with the same questions that I ask here. And these maps show the site density of Canyon Pintado, where masonry sites are part of a broader landscape of rock art panels, lithic and stone tool scatters, fire-affected rock features, and hearth features. And I outline a good opportunity for remote sensing along the major tributary confluences where there are known site concentrations. This map here shows 2 areas suited for such a study. I also cite the need for geoarchaeology and paleoenvironmental reconstruction in Douglas Creek, which would really help us understand the types of environmental changes the local Fremont were dealing with. And finally, I suggest that someone could run a least cost pathway analysis for the pinnacles here and test them against randomized analogous points on the landscape to determine whether the pinnacles were especially difficult to access. This would be a great way to test my inference that the pinnacles were inherently defensive. I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. LaBelle, for his support in this process, as well as my committee for their guidance and support. Lucas Trout with the BLM and Dudley Gardner were very useful and resourceful to me as I was out there. Kim Biela helped me pull a lot of artifacts and legacy data from CMPA, so thank you to her. Also like to thank my financial support, as well as the CSU Drone Center, which helped me get up to speed with drone operations so I could operate these vehicles on a National Historic property. And dedicate this to my son, who was born just a few months before I started writing. Here's my references cited just for this presentation, and I appreciate your time.
Great. Well, at this point, we'll open up to questions from the audience. Regularly.
Grace?
Is there any evidence that there were roofs or anything? Because you keep mentioning the possibility of habitation or something.
Yeah, so, well, the habitation, that argument is based on partially the material culture that's there. You got lots of evidence for hearths, evidence for food production and consumption, stone tool manufacture. But yes, there's evidence for roofs at the Edge site, which was excavated by LOPA in the 70s. They actually found roofing materials there. There's also this drill hole phenomenon that occurs at a lot of these sites, where they're about 15 centimeters across and deep enough to stick a timber post in there. And a lot of people think that those were related to roofs or maybe shade structures. However, Hawk, who I cited earlier, believes that they represent an agricultural calendar because of their alignment with metonic cycles, and I tend to think that they were probably roofed, yeah. Kate?
How is the idea of passive refuge fortification unique to you? Are you charting a third option that has not yet really been explored?
Beyond?
I mean, beyond the idea of stronghold versus refuge, is this a third path that you're?
I'm suggesting, well, so strongholds and refuges are part of the fortification continuum. They're understood on a continuum. So
Okay.
In my text, I argue that because it's on a continuum, you can have some qualities of one and some of the more of one, some of the other. When I had the results for my third question, it really contradicted the results from my first two. So I had to kind of deal with that. And like, well, maybe it's not so simple, like this simple binary of they do one thing and not the other. And I just made sense to me that a people, might be invested in, like, their primary strategic strategy would be to avoid most conflicts, but there could be some where they can assess the risk of potential danger and, you know, decide to confront it depending on who they're facing, you know, is kind of the idea.
Just as a quick follow-up, the rock art that does show some violence, could that factor into this third?
In terms of to deter people, like they should see that and be afraid.
Things that you said would be associated perhaps with more active defense.
Yeah, and I mean, but that also could be, if the rock art is meant to deter people, that might still be passive defensibility, if that you want people to avoid the area because they're afraid of how fearsome you may be. If it's meant to strike fear in people who are traveling through, that could be an idea.
Like a marketing campaign.
Yeah, so occupants wouldn't have to do the fighting for them if these images are already scary enough. It's kind of the idea. However, the headhunting image that I showed is not from Douglas Creek. It's from the Dinosaur National Park, which is across the border in Utah. But still, Fremont still associated, and like I mentioned earlier, associated with the Wheaton neighbors. So,
is there any evidence for that kind of thing within Douglas Creek?
Douglas Creek doesn't have those types of violent images. It does have a unique, it has a unique subvariant of Fremont rock art that attests to a regionalized expression of Fremont culture, but not the deep insinuations of violence like you see in the classic Vernal. But Kriesman made the argument that their locations at those tributary confluences are meant to be marking territory. Yes, Spencer, and then.
What was your methodology that made you land on these sites compared to the others on the drainage?
Yes, that is tricky. So I initially had planned for a couple more. So a lot of these sites are labeled differently because people have been they've been juggling ideas about what they are. So some of them are labeled overlook, some of them are labeled sky house, promontory. So I had to sort of pull all that data from the SHPO. And just based on the descriptions that were in state files, you know, take my best guess of what they were. I also had limited time to visit. Just like I said, there's another 8 on top of my 7, so that's 15. The idea was to get as many as I could inside Canyon Pintado, which I did, and then 2 more that were close to Canyon Pintado, so I could at least be making the argument that they were related to the same cultural phenomenon.
And there was a fire during your.
And there was a fire. There was the oil springs fire that the BLM kicked me out. That didn't help. So, yeah. Oh, and there was an issue with, I had one that I was going to go to, which might be the coolest one out there. Couldn't visit it because it was misplotted with state data, which is a problem that you can see sometimes, you know, with the coordinate system changes over the decades. That it was plotted incorrectly. Spent all day looking for it. Come to find, Dudley Gardner told me where it was. It was already too late. So, yes.
A related question to that is, how do these compare to the sites that were studied? I think it was McCool
And Yavorsky?
Yeah.
Architecturally?
Just in general, what you know about them versus the sites in your study area.
McCool and Yavorsky studied the ones in 9 Mile Canyon. They're much more elaborate. It looks like the walls are higher. They're also on extremely remote true pinnacle. I use the word pinnacle throughout my thing, but they're not, you know, they're on true pinnacles where it's like a really isolated landform in the sandstone landscapes, and it's extremely dangerous. They make the argument that the extreme inaccessibility of those sites are what make them refuges for passive defensibility.
And
they
study also have middens and other things associated with them that suggest that people were actually living
yes,
there for a while.
yeah, yes.
Very interesting, by the way, a real puzzle for sure. I wonder if on this kind of passive defense idea, whether just kind of in your mind you came up with just a kind of a scenario, like what would it look like when these people were using these things?
Yeah, man, I thought about that so much.
You have a, what, 4-month-old now? All I could think of was kids when I was looking at it, you know, that.
I was thinking, yeah, the kids were screaming inside your pinnacle and you're trying to keep them down. No, The idea that this was a travel corridor is just so compelling to me. And the text that I cite from the Spanish expedition, the fact that it was a known corridor for their guides in the late 1700s just, I think, speaks volume as to the use of that travel corridor over the centuries. And so it's likely that traders, raiders, friends, foes, and everyone in between were coming through there. And I envision a scenario where the Pinnacle occupants would have had a system of devising who's our friends and who is not. Maybe they understood who their friends and enemies were based on their clothing or the group size or what their intentions seemed to be, and would have made that negotiation each time. But their default mode was to hang out in the pinnacles until it seemed like there was a reason to come down. And in the text, I talked briefly about maybe there were, they had trade alliances and there were instances where they could descend and meet on friendly terms. Otherwise, people passing through, they just didn't have the means to defend themselves for whatever reason, or they were outmatched, and so they would have preferred just to hide.
Is there any sense of what the population was like in these?
Pretty sparse is the what I've seen in the literature.
So maybe these could have held it. So maybe everybody could have gotten these if necessary.
Oh, for the entire group size, potentially. I mean, if the question of contemporaneity is tricky here. If we don't know if they were all built and occupied during the same exact time. If one family was here, the other one was there, and they were all kind of avoiding conflicts together as a unit, that's a possibility. Tricky to say whether that was happening because we just don't have dates on all of them. Yes.
Just a follow-up to Bob's question. I mean, using your floor area for reconstructions of population that could live within or use one of those pinnacle structures, and then projecting that back to your future work, which is down in the floodplain looking for potential residential structures. Would you expect to see dispersed hamlets down there on the lowlands or actual villages? I mean, given what your group size looks like for the size of these structures, how could you use that to predict what you'd expect to see in your residential areas, which you say are located at these confluences down below?
So how could I use the site concentrations to get a sense for population size?
Yeah, so getting back to Bob's question, like what's the population look like within the canyon? This as compared from foragers to maybe this to say traditional Southwestern peoples, which at this time might have a village of 600 to 1,000 people. What would you expect to see? Would you expect to see a village of multiple pit house structures, or maybe just a hamlet of a structure or two with some houses? I mean, what would you like to predict as for future work down there?
I would expect to see pretty sparse population sizes and small groups living, because we know that the arable land was sparse, even though my models say up to 72 acres. That's not really proven. It seems like they weren't relying too much on corn and that they were doing more hunter-gathering than horticulture. So it seems like they would have only supported small population sizes. And if they were, and Reed and Metcalf talk about how towards the very end, this Douglas Creek might represent the final refuge for all Fremont people. And if that's the case, it seems like their sizes were diminishing, dwindling as they were facing incursions from other peoples. And yeah, I would expect very small sizes.
What else?
Donnie.
So regarding these being like possible, basically signal, or the ability to signal each other, are the pinnacles themselves close enough to where they can see each other with like a smoke signal, or even with a loud shout?
No, definitely not. Yeah, I talk about smoke signals a little bit. So there's no actual intervisibility between any of them. So that throughout my whole idea of a communication system within the canyon. That might change if people study the remaining 8. Doesn't seem likely though, because they're all pretty far apart. Some of them are close enough. Rocky Ford, Mountain Overlook, and Edge are in a little triangle formulation, and it is possible that with smoke signals that are strong and high enough that you could potentially, transmit a signal of some kind. It's difficult to prove. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, see up on the top there, Mountain Edge, Rocky Ford. Those three would be the best option in my mind, but a lot of these, there's larger landforms that obstruct pathways, and you'd have to have a pretty giant fire to communicate. So, yeah, the communication system wasn't really supported by the evidence here.
So based on your understanding of the surrounding regions, who are the possible sources of conflict? Are they adjacent Fremont communities? Are they actual true genetic or linguistic, completely unrelated peoples that are coming from elsewhere? I mean, where is the source of this conflict, and what might be the nature of that conflict? I mean, is it siege? Is it raiding? Is it some other mechanism? I mean, where on the spectrum does this lie?
Yeah. Well, first part of your question, their neighbors to the west were other Fremont groups. You have the San Rafael, you have the Tavaputs adaptation of the San Rafael, and then you have the Uinta to the north. And just north of here, just north of where you see Spook Mountain, there's another aggregation of Fremont life that seemed to be, concentrated separately from Canyon Pintado. So that appears to be a separate group. To the south, heading towards Gunnison, and then near Grand Junction, you had the Gateway people that were known to maybe be traders that facilitated contact between Fremont in this area and then traditional Southwestern people south of them. You also had the Aspen tradition, which seemed to be foragers that lived on the western slope, although some people think they might just be the Fremont, another adaptation of the Fremont living a more hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So in addition to those later Athabascan and Numic peoples that I cite that came in the 1300, there certainly was interaction between these Fremont, other Fremont nearby, as well as the Gateway people to the south. And then the nature of the violence, I mean, in one of the texts that I read, the introduction said that warfare is usually only viewed, how do they say it? They say that warfare is very difficult to extract from the archaeological record. So if it was there, it'd be difficult to find. What we have is the Sky Airy promontory that's west of some of these sites that has the burials of 9 individuals, possible evidence for cannibalism, although it's very controversial. Other than that, there just isn't really much evidence for direct violence in the area. But I tend to think that it might have been raiding, if people knew where those granaries were, maybe trying to raid the granaries, trying to pilfer crops from their cornfields, stuff like that would be my best guess.
Well, great, thanks so much, Joshua. Well, at this time, thank you for coming to the presentation, and if you'd like to wait around for Joshua, that'll take another half hour or so, or you can thank him or congratulate on the way out. At this time, we'll have a committee meeting with Joshua.
That was a beautiful presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, guys.